It's very good to be here, and welcome to London, Julian. I know you
Thank you
actually
very
did a
much.
talk earlier in the week, so you've been here for a week.
This is the fun one. So
Okay. This book, for those of you who haven't seen it, really has two main themes in it, and they are about architects and their relation to artists, and very often their friendship with artists, and then, as you probably more likely to expect, architects and how architects have approached the question of how to build museums, really essentially from the late 70s, early 80s through to the present, with an emphasis probably on the 90s and the first decade of this century. And sometimes those two concerns in the book come together. Notably with certain architects, I suppose, people like Richard Gluckman.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Frank Gehry in his own way, Stephen Hole,
yeah,
and I suppose also Herzog de Meuron is another example. And we'll probably talk about that. But I think we'll probably focus mainly on the issue of their relationship with museums rather than necessarily their relationship with artists. I just wanted to begin in a way by the very obvious question about how did you select the artists?
that's
Because you've chosen the generation.
Yeah.
Essentially, you've chosen a generation that broke with modernism
yes,
in a
yes,
broad sense.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's a good question, and it wasn't always easy. And of course, it's like any list. I mean, you sort of you think of people you could have included. The book also, I should say, maybe for context, it started out, it was going to be 10, and then that was a nice round number, and then it was 12, and then and in the end it was 16, and I had to sort of stop somewhere. So
Could have been 24.
yeah, it really could have been. So, but it already took 7 years. So,
Yeah.
But I think you're absolutely right in terms of the kind of weight being the 90s and 2000s, and so part of it was the sense that there had been a kind of historically important shift in how museums were thought about during that time, and wanting to really kind of capture that. So the book does have a kind of oral history component, and then of course I aspire to bring it all the way up to the present, which is a little bit impossible in a book because it moves slowly. And also I do think, I mean, this is something I'd love to talk to you about because you've overseen two major expansions of Tate Modern, or sort of the birth of Tate Modern, let's say, and then an expansion. But I think museums are also, in some ways, kind of slow institutions, which is not to call them conservative necessarily. I think it can be good, but I think that's another reason why the youngest architects in the book are in their early 50s, which is still young for an architect, but not exactly what you call emerging. So I guess, to actually try and give a specific answer to your question, it was sort of two things. I mean, it was looking around at my favorite museum buildings and who had done them, and it was actually also a lot about the connection to artists too. So, I tried to make sure that almost every architect included had some kind of deep, or sort of deeper than usual, let's say, connection. I mean, Herzog de Meuron, as you mentioned, one of their first projects, they were still architecture students, and they were designing floats for Joseph Beuys in parades, or someone like Elizabeth Diller really started her whole career as a kind of performance artist before she even made buildings. And so that somehow seemed very important to me, that everyone included has a really kind of intense connection to visual art.
We're going to turn this into a conversation, I hope. Because that's how we set it up. But I just want to ask one or two more questions at the beginning, just to kind of set the scene and the background, because you trained as Jessica told us, you trained as an architect and as a designer, and you practiced as both.
Yes.
But then you turn out to be a writer.
Yeah.
And those two things are not necessarily in opposition. I'm not making a comment about architects in my phrasing it in
within your rights to question.
But I just wonder how you came into writing, and as Jessica mentioned, you were a senior editor at Art Forum.
Yeah, I mean, I guess in some ways just luck, sort of. But I studied art history initially, and then in the course of that, actually became more and more interested in architecture, but seeing it through the lens of artists. So I can, this is probably a sort of art interested audience, so I can say I wrote my undergraduate thesis on Dan Graham's work in relationship to architecture. So I was sort of already thinking about artists of this period, 60s, 70s, 80s, looking at buildings. But I kind of got so interested in architecture that I said I wanted to study it. And what really appealed to me about it was that it seemed like it was dealing with so many of the same themes that artists were, but it had a kind of built-in public dimension. You know, that a lot of the artists I was interested in were kind of making maybe performance art or kind of public sculpture, works that was sort of trying to already get out of the gallery into the kind of real world, and then the idea being that maybe that's kind of inherently what architects do. So then I got a professional degree, I was practicing, and I guess I never really let go of writing because I felt like for me, that was kind of where I got the most thinking done, you know, and I worked in a few different kinds of offices, including for a while Vito Acconci, the great artist who was towards the end of his career trying to do more and more architecture projects. And it just, you know, I think in some ways watching him try and push his career into something that maybe it didn't quite want to be, I thought, okay, if I like writing and this seems like a good medium for me to kind of work through the problems I'm interested in, maybe I'll stick to that, if that makes sense.
I mean, one of the interesting things about the interviews to me was the way you move between the relationship between architects and artists, and then, as it were, a sense of an evolving story about how museums have changed in that 30-year period, really, from the since the 90s. Richard Gluckman, for instance, talks about the evolution of his own thinking, from dealing with what he would think of as somehow aesthetic space to a social space. So there is this sense of a chronology developing in the book. Did you think about organizing the interviews? I should say the interviews are presented in alphabetical order. So you start with David Adjaye and you end with Peter Zumthor.
Yeah.
Obviously, it could have done it by date of birth or by some sense of chronology. There would have been another story, though.
There would have been, but I honestly, I couldn't really think, and of course I'm a historian now, so I loved, I was very attracted to the chronological idea, but if it makes sense, I couldn't really figure out what weight to give, or what date to give weight to, So, because birth date can be somewhat arbitrary. For example, piano, I think the earliest museum project discussed in the book is Renzo Piano's Pompidou.
Yeah.
But of course, he was basically 30 years old or still in his 30s when he won the competition, famously. So that, just listing him by his birthday doesn't really, capture the beginning of his impact as a designer of museums. Just for example, so I could, and then I thought, well, what if I tried to date everyone's first significant project? But then you get into very weird, Denise Scott Brown is probably most well known for the Sainsbury Wing here, but she did an incredible museum in 1976 that I would argue is kind of the first real postmodernist museum building. And it's not very well known even in the States. It's a university museum for a college in the Midwest. So is that a significant project? It just got too confusing, and alphabetical is very, very hard to argue with. So in Oberlin, it's an amazing building if you get the chance.
So you say, I think at one point, the core premise of this book is that art museums are significant because they offer one of the few remaining opportunities for architects to realize the full potential of their calling. Do you want to expand on that a little bit?
I'd be happy to. And in a way, since you brought up Gluckman, I'll maybe start there, because you said, okay, this is a generation of architects that I've chosen for the book that broke with modernism, and that's true. But another way of telling that story would be that this is a group of architects that didn't have modernism available to them. And so Gluckman is interesting because he was educated in the late 60s, early 70s, and we talk about this a bit in the book, but if he had gone to school 10 years earlier, he probably would have graduated and been doing university campuses, social housing. the States, not as much as the UK, but the States was in that post-war period really investing a lot in social architecture and
I mean, the same would
infrastructure.
be true here.
Right.
I mean, there was a
Yeah.
similar kind of break occurred here in the 80s.
Exactly.
Basically, public housing stopped being built.
Exactly.
Hospitals, I won't say
Yeah,
stopped, but
yeah.
it was a slowdown anyway.
No, it's true, and it's actually, since you bring that up, actually David Chipperfield, even though he's younger, I think
Yeah.
there wasn't a complete historical coincidence, obviously, and he tells a very similar story. So basically, Gluckman,
Shops.
between graduating and opening his business, New York City has almost gone bankrupt. The Housing and Urban Development sort of wing of the state government has in fact gone bankrupt, et cetera, et cetera. And Chipperfield basically finished school in kind of high modernism and then was trying to open his own business after Thatcher and had a very similar experience. So they both did a lot of commercial retail, but I think they both were drawn to galleries as kind of public spaces from the beginning, because you weren't going to get a civic center, but even a small gallery is theoretically a kind of public program. So I would just say that kind of social aspect is really there from the beginning, I think, for most of these architects, if that makes sense. Thinking about looking at art as a kind of collective public activity and that being part of the appeal of the museum as a program, I think.
So let's go on to the program.
Okay.
Because the program, as I was suggesting, and you've already commented on, and we talked about in relation to Gluckman, has changed pretty dramatically. I mean, when you look at the brief, look at the Whitney Museum uptown, and you look at the Whitney Museum downtown, they are the product of, obviously different architects, but very different moment, and clearly a very different brief.
Completely, and I should have this statistic at my command, so this may not be exactly right, but there's something incredible where the Whitney downtown has, only like 15% more gallery space, but overall it's 50% bigger. If you compare those buildings in detail, it really shows you how much the program has expanded. And I think, almost everyone I interviewed for the book talks about this, and I think it's unquestionably happening, so one has to reckon with it. And I think there are sort of two ways to look at it. On the one hand, there can be a sort of hand-wringing because what you might see is the kind of purity of the museum program has been lost. The Breuer building, the old Whitney uptown, is really beloved in New York because it's basically just a stack of galleries. The materials are beautiful, the proportions are perfect. It's just a great space to look at art and almost nothing else. There's a cafe in the basement, that's basically it. No auditorium, barely a shop, like sort of none of the stuff we associate with museums. But on the other hand, I think the museum program has expanded to encompass things like education. It's not all sort of the commercialization or the sort of bastardization of the aesthetic experience, in other words. And so I think it is ultimately probably a good thing, the way that the program has expanded.
Yeah, that program has expanded dramatically, hasn't it?
Yeah.
And most particularly, I would say, by the provision of public space within a sense of public space within the building.
Absolutely, and
you can obviously take the Turbine Hall as a
that's what
prime
I was going to say.
prime example of that, for instance.
Exactly.
But that it's not confined to that.
No, but I think that is. I do think Turbine Hall was really paradigmatic, and I would be interested in sort of turning the tables on you a bit and asking you sort of how those conversations with Jacques and Pierre unfolded. But I would just say, as another example, in New York, the MoMA Atrium was very controversial, the edition that opened in 2004 by Yoshio Taniguchi, because it felt sort of ostentatious and it wasn't gallery space. And people were really upset, this is a building in New York City, space is at a huge premium, why devote all this to an atrium? And actually then when I interviewed Liz Diller, who did the most recent renovation expansion, I asked her, did you think about basically turning that back into galleries? And she said, we did. We thought about, it's such a big space, you could have basically sliced it in half horizontally and had 2 floors of galleries. But actually, she realized that by that time, there had been so many iconic art installations in it that artists had really sort of embraced that space. And so I think that's part of the other side of this program expansion, it's not just literal things like a shop and, an auditorium and an education center, but art is really changing, and art doesn't necessarily want the kind of traditional gallery space, and that's part of the general expansion. So, but I guess.
Okay, so you say art doesn't want traditional gallery space. So the pressures that are changing the museum are coming, I think you're saying, in part from artists.
Yes.
In part from, I would suggest, curators.
Yes.
In part from the public itself.
Yes.
Demonstrating that it welcomes a certain openness, the ground floor or the basement, without going up the steps or to the temple. So just talk a little bit more, because you've obviously talked to a lot of architects, you've talked to artists. What have architects learned from artists?
I mean, that's a fantastic question, and I would say,
you've got an hour to answer.
I know. I could talk about that for an hour on its own, but I guess what I would say is, it's refreshingly indirect, the lessons they take sometimes, and I think, not to get too academic about it, but there's a strong tradition in the historiography of modernism, I think, in both art and architecture, of thinking of the relationship as kind of a literal one. There are famous comparisons between Mies van der Rohe's plans and de style paintings, or the idea, Corbusier was famously obsessed with Cubism and Picasso, and the idea that somehow artists were a kind of visual vanguard for architects to follow. And I think that's really fallen away. I mean, not completely. Actually, there's an architect who will remain unnamed, who's not in the book, but who very proudly told me that one of their buildings, the plan was based on a Bryce Marden painting. And I just thought that was sort of such an odd, anachronistic move. But I think in general, the lessons are, in a way, kind of harder to distill. I mean, I'm thinking of Peter Zumthor. One of the artworks he talks about as being the most influential of any he saw was an early encounter with Walter Di Maria's vertical earth kilometer, which is in Kassel. It was installed there for Documenta, and for those of you who don't know, it's a bronze rod that's a kilometer long, buried into the earth. So all you see is a little plaque with this. I think it's something like 10 centimeters in diameter. Anyway, it's very small. So in a way, that's kind of a bizarre thing for an architect to like, because it's not really architectural, but he speaks about being so inspired by the kind of sheer ambition of that idea, and somehow really relating to that and kind of translating it into his works. I think if I can, I guess to try and give you a concrete answer on a reasonable timescale, I would say I think what architects see in artists' work is a lot of the same themes, space, materials, perceptual experience, but sort of either without rules, or at least according to a completely separate set of rules. And that's very inspiring to them, because I think they do deal with so many constraints on a day-to-day basis. So I think seeing someone like Walter Di Maria work with the material in a way that an architect would, if an architect told their client, oh, by the way, this is the building, and by the way, I want to bury something a kilometer deep, it would just, they would get laughed at, basically, right? So if that makes sense, it's a kind of looser fit than I was almost expecting, I think.
I think I would argue also that artists, the practice of artists and their determination to show their work or install their work, and this is particularly true of sculptors rather than painters, install their work in post-industrial spaces, for example, has fundamentally changed the way in which architects have been have thought about the sort of space that's required in their buildings.
Completely, and I think...
and it's the big change that occurred, really, from the generation before piano to the generation that piano and others in your book really acknowledge and accept, I think.
Absolutely, and I think just the idea that a space for art didn't have to be purpose-built, and in fact that maybe it shouldn't be purpose-built, that I think that was a real lesson from artists. And I think, again, I think this kind of gets back to the culture of modernism, but I think because the modern movement was so much based on sort of rebuilding, like in Europe, literally, in the States, sort of these very problematic questions of urban renewal and, but the idea that good architecture needed to start with the tabula rasa was very deeply ingrained, I think, in the kind of the way architects thought. And so it took, people like Donald Judd, for example, sort of just working in old buildings and kind of doing amazing things with them to kind of open people's eyes. I think that's absolutely true.
I mean, I knew when we were contemplating doing Tate Modern, not that it was called that then, but using the Bankside power station, there was huge hostility to the notion of not tearing down the power station and building a new building.
Right.
And I think that one of the things that gave us the confidence to proceed with the reuse of that building was the fact that artists so evidently welcomed the opportunity to show their work in post-industrial spaces.
Yeah.
And whether that was at Schaffhausen,
right,
or whether it was in Los Angeles at what's now called the Geffen, what was the Temporary Contemporary,
right,
which opened in 1982, 83, something like that.
I believe 82 exactly. Yeah.
And that space, I mean, it was always very interesting to me that Richard Koszalek, who was the director of the Museum of Contemporary Art in Los Angeles, ended up with two buildings. One was the garage, the former police garage, which unbroken, open post-industrial space. And then there was this very finely wrought Isesaki building,
right,
which was kind of rather refined and very, very beautiful. And the combination of those two gave him an incredible opportunity to offer artists very diverse spaces in which to show their work. And so he'd make one kind of show in one space and then a very different kind of show in the other. And it's the reason that I asked him to come on the jury for the choice of architect for Tate Modern, was the fact that he'd had this experience. And he was kind of brilliant to be, as a museum curator who would then critique the proposals that were coming forward to us.
That's fascinating background because we should also say that in a way, very ironically, what's now the Geffen Contemporary, I think it was called the Temporary Contemporary.
Yeah, it was,
It's a Frank Gehry project.
It's Frank Gehry, and he hardly touched it.
Right.
There wasn't enough money for Frank Gehry to do what he would have done later.
It's the last thing you would associate with him, but we speak about it in some depth in the book, and what I loved is it comes directly out of his friendships with artists. So, I mean, this is decades before Bilbao, basically, but, it was basically hanging out with his artist friends in LA and noticing that, every time he would go over to their house for dinner, they would have completely redone the furniture, and just kind of realizing that how artists kind of thrived on this flexible space. And that and Schaffhausen are really the only, before Tate Modern, the only big institutions I can even think of. There was what Dia was doing, but that was a bit different because it was so much based on a kind of like, one artist per building kind of permanent installation.
Yeah, Dia Beacon didn't exist at that point.
No, exactly. Yeah.
You also talk about the way in which architects have pushed curators and pushed boards of trustees into thinking differently about the museum. Again, if you come back to Tate Modern, it was by no means a given that there would be a turbine hall space.
Right.
Okay, so when we were doing the initial brief for that building, which had 3 sections to it, the boiler house, which is the galleries that opened in 2000,
right,
the turbine hall, and then the switch house, which became the second phase of Tate Modern. We knew at the outset that we didn't have enough money to do the whole thing.
Right.
So we focused on the expectation that we would convert the boiler house in some form.
Okay.
And that it was an open question about what would happen to the turbine hall.
Yeah.
So there would never have been enough money to build it, but Rafael Moneo, for instance, filled the turbine hall in his initial proposal, that was one of the shortlisted proposals, with galleries.
Right.
It was a big open space, he filled it with galleries. Other people used the space in some way, But what was brilliant about Herzog was, and both Jack and Pierre, was their proposal to take out the temporary floor that was at ground level. Because the conventional thing would have been to have had ground floor, and then you would have put the auditorium in the basement, etc.
Yeah.
And they didn't want to do that. They wanted actually to make the Turbine Hall into, in a sense, the entrance to the museum, and make it the facade and make it the street within the museum. Yeah. And even in their very first proposal for the competition, you know, they had sculpture in that space. They actually had a montage of Rachel Whitefried's house.
That's interesting. Yeah.
It would have been quite nice to have preserved that house in that way. But
Well, I mean, I would just say, I guess, first, I think that their decision, their insight that it would work as a kind of ramp entry was really brilliant, and was really a few decades ahead of its time, because now I think that everyone is kind of thinking about the entry sequence of museums as incredibly important, and how can it be more welcoming? And it is really the inversion of this sort of Beaux-Arts temple model, where there's a grand staircase and a colonnade, and, you know, there's the museum as a kind of projection of power, and the way that entrance just kind of just sort of gently sucks you in, I think is really beautiful. But my question for you, actually, while we're on this subject, is if you had any qualms about the scale, because it's so interesting you would mention Rachel Whitefried, because that's actually the first Unilever series I had seen, and it was fascinating, because of course, I think anyone who had seen her work even in the 90s already would have said, oh, this is a very architectural artist. You know, this is someone who's thinking about space, thinking about buildings, but that installation was really breathtaking just because it was at a whole new scale. And I feel like that's what Turbine Hall offered a lot of the artists who worked there. But I'm also thinking about what you had done in the, I guess now Tate Britain, but at the time just called the Tate Galleries, and the Duveen Galleries, where you had started to invite artists, particularly Richard Serra, I'm thinking, because I've always felt, I think that was in the early 90s, 92. Yeah. And I've always felt that was such an important project for him, because it's these, you know, large forged steel sculptures in the kind of neoclassical architecture. It's very, very tough, kind of adversarial, but somehow it all really works. And I think that his work, to me, wouldn't have ever worked in Turbine Hall. I mean, it famously doesn't really work that well in Bilbao, you know, where it can be dwarfed by space, I think. And so I'm just wondering if, you know, I feel like what that space gave a lot of the artists who showed there was a chance to do something at a kind of unprecedented scale within their practice, but it was also much bigger than, you know, obviously like a typical Soho loft, or, you know, it was much bigger than that. Spaces that a certain generation of artists had grown up with.
Well, I suppose I'd make two comments, given what you've just said. The first is that I've always had the ambition to do a Giacometti show in the Turbine Hall.
Okay.
But not with the late works, but only with the works from the early 40s.
Okay.
The very small ones.
Yeah.
So that people would have to find it.
I love that.
rather than have it come out. So that's one comment.
Okay.
As far as Serra is concerned, I agree with you that the weight and measure,
exactly,
two pieces that he installed in the Duveen Galleries, which, you know, in a way was a kind of dry run for what the Turbine Hall became.
Yeah.
I mean, I still think it was one of his most successful pieces. But I will also tell you that he never forgave me, because he took it as a personal thing, but I'd made this decision. That he should be denied the opportunity to put several of his talked ellipses in the Turbine Hall in the way that he did in Bilbao.
Right. Interesting.
So, I mean, what happened was that, you know, we started to commission artists to use the turbine for the Turbine Hall space. And it was quite clear to me that every friend of Richard Serra kept saying to him every 10 minutes, Richard, when are you going to do the Turbine Hall?
Right.
And he got more and more irritated by this.
Interesting.
and it became quite difficult.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we can move on from Richard's there, but I can't resist adding. I mean, that it's the mezzanine that I think really creates problems, because his work, and he even writes about this at some point, but his work doesn't want you to understand the plan view. Like, it really
Mezzanine in Bilbao.
In Bilbao, I feel to me that would be my main hesitation in Turbine Hall as well. That it's really not work that wants you to have a kind of bird's eye view. The whole point is to kind of enter into these structures not knowing, and have this sort of incredible phenomenological discovery, right? And so I think it's not, I guess I should clarify, it's not just scale, but it's kind of how the architecture works. And I think at Dia Beacon, which in some ways is not an entirely successful space, for those of you who've been, there are torqued ellipses, and it's this huge factory, but they're actually tucked into what I believe was a garage way in the back. So they're kind of crammed into the space, and it's incredibly effective, I think, for that reason. The Giacometti thing is interesting, because I don't know if this is in your mind, but actually there was a show, I believe in Paris in the 80s, that actually both Zumthor and Jacques Herzog mentioned. And it is actually, I think there's something about those tiny figures that kind of captures one's imagination. And they both talk about being very inspired by seeing one of those tiny figures in a very large gallery space. So it's also true that you don't, just because architects are creating big spaces, they're not necessarily envisioning monumental artworks,
You talked about phenomenology a moment ago, or you used the word, and the kind of question that sits underneath so many of the issues that are raised in your book is, what is the best way to encounter a work of art? Do you have an answer to that question?
I certainly don't. I wouldn't claim to. But I would say that I do feel there's been a kind of paradigm shift that I'm very interested in, which is that modernism, by and large, was predicated on a kind of individual aesthetic experience, right? And there's a certain irony, and I try and write about this because, of course, modernism is also famous for these, wonderful utopian avant-gardes, like the constructivists, hoping to really sort of change society through art. But the reality is, it was usually supported by collectors with good taste. It wasn't usually being institutionally supported. So it was essentially works made for someone's living room, essentially. So it was small scale sculpture or painting. And that paradigm, really carried on for a long time. And it's interesting, when I was kind of doing my homework for interviewing Liz Diller, I found a quote by William Rubin, who was a beloved MoMA curator, when he was interviewed when the Caesar Pelli edition, which was 2 MoMAs ago, opened in the 80s, and he pointed out that the average Jackson Pollock is actually smaller than the average Delacroix, which is not at all what someone would, you think of Pollock as this monumental painter, but it actually makes complete sense because, salon painting was essentially a form of public art, and modernism was in, direct opposition to that. That's sort of the birth of modernism that we all learn about in art history. So of course it was all work for private viewing, and it's a long-winded way of winding up to the point that I think that's really shifted again. And I think that it's spaces like Turbine Hall that have done it, that I think now viewing contemporary art is increasingly understood by artists, architects, and curators as a collective experience. And I think that's fascinating. I think it has so many exciting possibilities. And when you think historically, it's actually not weird at all, because that's actually, I would argue, world historically, that's probably the more common kind of default for how art is thought of in a culture. But I think, at least in the West, we were in this kind of strange moment in the 20th century where modernism, the idea of encountering art was that you would go into a room with a masterpiece by yourself and have this kind of, transformative experience. And I think it's shifting, and you see that very directly registered in the architecture museums. So that's sort of, if I can, that would be the big point I try and distill in terms of what kind of experience is best for art.
Yeah, I can remember going very frequently, I suppose in the 70s and the 80s, to the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam.
Yeah.
Which I always regarded as a kind of paradigm, really, because it was so beautifully installed.
Yeah.
And the rooms were very gracious.
Yeah.
And you would walk up the staircase. Many people in this room will know that space, but that museum. You walk up this grand stair, you come into this really huge room,
Yes. Yeah.
top-lit
Yeah.
room. And Eddie de Wilde, the director, from 63 to 85, always reserved that space for the Barnett Newmans, the de Koonings, and so on, the American American abstract painting. And you somehow came to know Barnett Newman through that experience. And then in 85, he did a show just at the moment when he left the museum. It was a show that was a survey of painting from 1945, which is when he had become a director in Eindhoven, to 1985. So it was 40 years of painting.
Okay.
Anyway, on that occasion, I think he gave the big space to Kiefer, probably.
Okay.
But he put the Barnett Newmans in one of the smaller galleries somewhere.
Yeah.
And honestly, they came alive.
Yeah.
Because they'd been painted in the
Exactly.
studio
Yeah.
of a certain size. There's the Bill Rubin point. Really.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. That's so interesting.
So they'd been painted in a space of a certain size where they were intended to overwhelm you rather than to be looked at.
Right. Right.
And there they were in Amsterdam in exactly that condition.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's a fascinating example, and I would say that's, I mean, in a funny way, it's a version of the Richard Serra problem too, right? I mean, I think artists do have a kind of, whether it's just as simple as their studio space, but I think a lot of art is made with a kind of sweet spot for the viewing, and obviously museums can put it wherever they want, but I think there's something to that, and I think especially a work like Newman, I would argue, is actually in a lot of ways related to Serra in terms of begging for kind of phenomenological experience and walking past the painting, etc. It doesn't want to be looked at from afar as a whole, so that makes complete sense.
There's an interesting question posed by Liz Diller in the book, in one of the interviews, where she says, should architecture be the protagonist or the background player to the art on its walls? Do you have any view on that?
I mean, it's kind of the fundamental question, and I mean, maybe this is the obvious move, but I would try and kind of undo the binary, basically, because I think that one thing that emerges as a huge theme in the book is actually circulation space, and that maybe sounds kind of pedestrian, but museum attendance figures are really up around the world, and the sheer number of people moving through these buildings is a kind of, I mean, it's a wonderful thing, but it's also a real technical challenge. And so I think that there are opportunities in the museum for architecture to be the protagonist, or we could just even limit it to entry sequences. And I think Tate Modern is a perfect example. I mean, I think the ramp and the decisions that were made around that is architecture as protagonist, and it's absolutely wonderful. I think where, and not everyone agrees with this, but I think where architecture should maybe be a bit more in the background is in the gallery spaces. And I think it also depends, it depends what kind of art is being shown, but Frank Gehry, for example, who's famously sort of invented the protagonist approach, but he kind of defends, actually in the Foundation Louis Vuitton, so it'd be interesting because I know you're going to be working in that space, but his claim, anyway, is that he does include basically white boxes for artists who are dead, is how he puts it.
He makes this distinction between white boxes for artists who are dead,
right,
and grand spaces for artists who are alive.
Right, and
so he wants to give, he says, he wants to give artists the opportunity to use these big spaces in ways that are creating new work.
Exactly.
Of course, he then goes on to criticize Serra for taking the
for
whole
doing
of
exactly
that space.
Right. Well, and I mean, I think part of this question is about kind of egos and competitiveness, and so I think unfortunately some of it is just sort of very petty, like who wants to be the star of the museum, but I do think there's something to that distinction that Gehry makes, and I think that it's amazing how many artists I talk to who want a challenge, and who are actually, so protagonist is funny because it implies that the architecture is somehow going to take over, but if you think about it, that's very patronizing to the artists, right? Because really we're talking about kind of specificity, character, idiosyncrasy, and all of those things that are qualities in a space that potentially an artist can respond to in a really interesting way. They could be very provocative and productive. But that is primarily, we're talking about contemporary art commissioned for those spaces, and that does seem like an important distinction.
You were talking about circulation a moment ago. It's interesting because I think Sejima talks in her interview with you about the fact that when Sana was doing the Kanazawa project, which has obviously been incredibly influential, which opened in, 2004?
Yes.
Yeah. So she talks about the fact that she tried to get a different kind of balance between circulation and exhibition space. Not with the intention that circulation should be grand, but that there shouldn't be such a distinction between circulation and exhibition.
Right.
And that probably reflected, the way in which artists were wanting their work to be seen, not necessarily in a refined gallery space, but also just a different kind of sense of how you move through the museum.
Absolutely, and that, I mean, for those of you who aren't familiar with the project, it's just such a beautiful kind of diagrammatic idea, but it's essentially a glass cylinder that's quite generously proportioned, and then sort of everything inside the glass is technically the museum, and then the galleries are these sort of little pavilions scattered inside. And I think the very relevant backstory to that project, the reason they won the competition is that the city actually had put out a brief for 2 projects, a public park and a museum, and then they said, well, we think you can kind of do it all with one building. And so the idea was that the circulation was very, very open-ended, and as always, these things have to be correlated with institutional policy, but it's kind of like the museums here. I guess you don't have to pay until you go to the special exhibition gallery, so you can walk in, you can sort of wander throughout this whole cylinder completely freely. And I think that that's one of the most successful examples I can think of an architect trying to kind of merge those experiences. At the other extreme, I'm thinking of Rem Koolhaas's proposal for the Whitney, which he lost. But there was fast space and slow space. So it was very binary. The idea was you were basically either on an escalator zipping around, or you were like pausing in a gallery. And I just think that's kind of not sustainable anymore.
His proposal for Tate Modern had a fast and a slow lane.
Okay, there you go, yeah.
Because he put the entrance to the building, there was an entrance where the chimney is, on either side, but the main entrance to the building was not the turbine hall, but the oil tanks.
Oh, interesting.
I think he was the only one who had the temerity to propose we should do the oil tanks and the turbine hall and the boiler house all in one go. And he assured me that it wouldn't cost more than whatever it was, but it was clearly going to cost a lot more.
Right, that's interesting.
So he put the entrance in the kind of southwest corner of one of the oil tanks and took you through the oil tanks and then up a series of ramps. There were ramps that went through the turbine hall until you came to the upper levels.
Okay.
But in that whole sequence, he provided almost no galleries.
Okay.
And the way we ran the competition, there was a moment halfway through the competition where we went and did a visit to each of the practices and critiqued what they were doing to get a sense of how they would respond.
Okay.
And whether or not they would be good people to work with.
Okay.
So when we went to Rem's studio practice in Rotterdam, we talked about the fact there were no galleries. And I said, you've really got to provide some galleries, Rem. We've got a lot, we've got great works from the early part of the 20th century, and that's why we're building this building. So his response was really intelligent, which was to go and ask Richard Gluckman to design him some galleries.
Interesting. Okay.
So when we came to the final round of the competition, they came together. And I think actually if they'd come together earlier, it might have really worked, and they might have, they effectively ran second in the competition.
Okay. That's interesting, because I knew that their competition was credited to a collaboration. I didn't know how it came about. I mean, no, I mean, that's fascinating to hear, and I think in some ways I really give him a lot of credit for recognizing early, I think, that circulation was such a problem for museums, because I think, I mean, I chose the cover of the book. It's the sort of famous crowds in front of the Mona Lisa, but we're all familiar with, in New York, this would be Van Gogh's Starry Night. I mean, I think there is, again, it's sort of it's a problem of anachronism, right? That these were works that were essentially intended for one form of contemplation, and now they're in these, huge buildings with thousands of visitors a day. And I think OMA, and I should clarify, I didn't actually interview Rem, I interviewed Shohei Shigematsu, who runs OMA New York, who's become their kind of, within that practice, sort of the museum specialist. I think they were attuned to that quite early, but I think in some ways, I don't know, maybe this is sort of how that practice works. They're very conceptual, and I think they were kind of excited about the binary, and kind of excited about playing with extremes, and so their solutions weren't so synthetic in a way, like a sauna, or even as Tate Modern ended up, because we could say a turbine hall is also a circulation space if we wanted to, and we wouldn't be wrong. So.